Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It's program number 735, and it's January the 6th, 1986. I don't usually make local. There is a musician who's in this country now. He's going to be in the Bay Area, and he may be traveling around, and I'm sure he is, around the rest of the country. His name is Dick Gaughn. Gaughn, and you may want to take the opportunity to hear him. I imagine he'll be mostly at small clubs in the various larger cities of the United States and some not so large. A listener to World Watchers turned me on to him, sent me a record of his, quite revolutionary. One song's on revolution and one on prisoners, and very sympathetic in the political sense, and an activist of his own sort. And in Germany, when he was performing, he had some kind of a throat infection or disease, and there was a question of whether he would ever be able to sing again. Obviously, he's recovered. He'll be in the Bay Area at the Great American Music Hall the week of January 21st in San Francisco, and he's going to be in Santa Cruz at Moraga Hall Wednesday, January 22nd, and I'm going to try and attend and to hear him. It was really a surprise that I saw that he would be so close to home base here, and I was interested in how he recovered and what he's been doing since he got sick in Germany. The newspapers this past week have had stories about a new book coming out regarding John Paul Getty, the oil man. The book is by Robert Lenzer, Lenzer, and it's called The Great Getty. And in the process of writing it, Lenzer sent to Washington under Freedom of Information and got files on Mr. Getty, and discovered that he had what he calls a flirtation with Adolf Hitler, that he supported, his ideas supported Hitler's, that he was sympathetic to the Nazis, and that J. Edgar Hoover had documents dated December 18th, 1941, on whether or not to have some kind of internal security or rounding up, apprehending of John Paul Getty. Getty, in his memos and diaries, was sympathetic to the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the invasion of Poland. He considered Hitler a very strong man, and which he was, and there were allegations, evidently, that he sold oil to the Germans in Mexico. Now, John Paul Getty is gone, but there are stories that his son, John Paul Getty Jr., was closely linked. Not only stories, but absolutely true, to Otto von Bolschwing, the head of the Iron Guard, the Romanian Iron Guard of the SS. And also, Klaus von Bulow has been employed by Mr. Getty's son, having the same proclivities or interest in Nazis. Von Bulow's name became prominent because of his wife being in a coma and the two trials for attempted murder charges on his wife. Von Bulow allegedly was the ring boy at Hermann Goering's wedding, and Mr. Getty, the father, was, saying that he knew Hitler and knew Goering, and that he was sympathetic psychologically and also assisting them, evidently, during the war effort. Von Bulow is moving to Europe, but he's in the employ of John Paul Getty's son. In 1981, I learned that Frank Turple and Edwin Wilson were on the West Coast working with a firm called Stanford Technology, and realizing how high up they were in the intelligence community, I called Pete Carey in San Jose at the San Jose Mercury, spoke to him, and he did a long article, November the 20th, 1981. In case there's new listeners and you don't have this, send a self-addressed stamped envelope to me, and I'll give you a copy of this article. It's called Ex-Nazi's Brilliant U.S. Career, Strangled in a Web of Lies. And among other things, it tells how this man from the Waffen-SS, who then went to work for our CIA, worked in a corporation called TCI. One of the board of directors was John Paul Getty Jr., the son of the oil billionaire who was sympathetic to Hitler, and von Bolschwing was made president of the corporation in 1970. And this article goes into all the close affiliations in the Bay Area, particularly to von Bolschwing, and also the international connections and the national. It involves Thomas Franzioli, a banker, to the Boston Cabot family, and money went for Otto von Bolschwing traveling in Europe through the First National Bank of Boston, that's been in the news recently, and Warner Lambert Pharmaceuticals, Mr. Elmer Bobst, was the fellow who pushed Richard Nixon's career. Nixon lost to John Kennedy, and Elmer Bobst and Warner Lambert were pushing Nixon's career. And, of course, as soon as Kennedy's head was blown off, Nixon eventually then became president. In 1950, it had Nicolae Maloxa, the Iron Guard of the Romanian Iron Guard, brought to his office in Whittier, and Otto von Bolschwing was the head of the Romanian Iron Guard, and he was Adolf Eichmann's superior. Among other people that he had working with him at TCI was a woman named Helene von Damm, who for 8 years was the secretary, in quotes, to Ronald Reagan, the right-hand woman, under and with Ronald Reagan in California. Then she went on to work in Washington with the transition teams and appointments, and then became ambassador to Austria. So the links of Getty and the father to Hitler didn't end with that one time period, but the head of the Gehlen operation, Reinhard Gehlen's operation, Hitler's Eastern intelligence chief, was taken over by von Bolschwing when Gehlen went back to Germany, and he traveled with the Cabot manufacturing company. The Cabot Lodge family were part of the von Bolschwing network, and it was Henry Cabot Lodge who ran against John Kennedy as vice president with Richard Nixon, and all the people involved in the murder of John Kennedy, or the cover-up, or the pushing of politicians that would replace the Kennedys to keep the Nazi network intact, are pretty well described in this one long article by Pete Carey. Also in the Washington Times, there was a story by Georgie Angar this week, Von Damm Without Regrets, and it's telling how that she's going to step down as the ambassador to Austria as of the first of the year. Now she took on her fourth husband. She says, my third husband, I never really lived with him when I got here. And she tells how she fell in love with this well-known person from Austria, and she has been asked to give up her position as the ambassador to Austria. Nancy Reagan didn't like her having four husbands and dumping the third one and switching as soon as she got to Vienna. But Helene von Damm was brought to this country by a man of military intelligence known as William Clark, who then went on to be a justice on the Supreme Court in California thanks to the Reagan appointment, the national security advisor in Washington, and now I think he's waiting for a Supreme Court job. And Helene von Damm and Otto von Bolschwing are closely connected, of course, to the Waffen-SS of the current time, and the Nazis, and the father of this Getty was sympathetic and assisting Adolf Hitler during the war. So after the war, one of the top Nazis of the entire world, who was not apprehended or even considered a war criminal, came to California and influenced Ronald Reagan and had a literal babysitter in his offices, and took care of the connections that Ronald Reagan had, which were escalating towards Edward Teller and the future Star Wars and the race to control the world. Now, speaking of Vienna, a subscriber to World Watcher sent me out of Minneapolis an article from their newspaper on their governor, Rudy Perpich, P-E-R-P-I-C-H. He's taken several trips to Austria, where he has been visiting Helene von Damm, the current ambassador, and the state of Minnesota is ready to take a 11th century castle that would be given to the University of Minnesota. All they have to do is to put $4 million to renovate it, and Mr. Perpich has been going back and forth. Several of the people in his own state say he isn't taking care of our farms and our conditions here, but he has a necessity to go back to Vienna. As I say, he's made several trips and met with von Damm, so that America is getting international in the sense that our governors are ready to buy castles in Austria and keep this contact. The von Damm link to von Bolschwing is still continuous, I am sure. Just because she's not ambassador, Vienna is a very important part of American politics. And I even question the shooting at the Vienna airport, or whether it was a provocateur setup, which we are so great at doing. And as we broaden out and incorporate these Germans into our system continuously since World War II, now the state of Minnesota will have a castle, which is a great place for going back and forth with bag money payoffs, international connections, because the network of the Odessa is not over, but maintaining castles in places like Austria, American people buying castles for a particular state, this can go on continuously and be a wonderful nest of espionage. Speaking of espionage, Richard von Weizsäcker, the president of Germany, asked this past week over Christmas that Rudolf Hess, the former Nazi leader, be released from Spandau prison. He's all heart. His father was the liaison of the Vatican to Adolf Hitler. He's the current president of Germany that set up with Helmut Kohl the Bitburg ceremony honoring the Waffen-SS, and now he's asking that we plead for the release of Rudolf Hess. Another person that wanted Hess released was Larry McDonald, and Soldier of Fortune last month had an article how the mercenaries could release Hess. I'll do one whole hour on Hess very soon because he's a very interesting person. He actually flew to Scotland and wanted to go to Britain in 1941, and America wasn't at war, and yet he's locked up as a war criminal. He says he had nothing to do with what went on afterwards, and he has been kept locked up for 44 years. But he's a symbol because he was there flying over to England and Scotland to coax Great Britain to combine with Germany and invade the Soviet Union. And for all this time, he's the last prisoner at Spandau, and there's even a question of whether it's Hess. But while von Weizsäcker, he threw in release Mandela and in South Africa and let Hess out, and Andrei Sakharov. Hess can't be a propaganda tool much longer, but he's a hero to people like Willis Carto and the far, far right, and to the new Soldier of Fortune operations that want to see him out. And so he asked for Mandela to be released, which would be impossible, and to Agca, the Soviet Union, with Sakharov. He's concerned about individuals. But while the president of Germany is allegedly concerned at that level, the Los Angeles Times had a long article, November 21st. West Germany Chancellor Helmut Kohl met with American Jewish leaders last month to reassure them that the new Germany would not abandon its special interests with the state of Israel, but assurances are deceiving because in a secret deal last May, just at the time of Bitburg, West Germany authorized the direct sale to Saudi Arabia of 105 MMs and 155 mm artillery. The artillery is used by NATO as a tactical nuclear weapon delivery system. In addition, German industry will build a huge factory for the production of munitions for this artillery, as well as the 120 mm Leopard 2 tank cannon. The total cost for the deal is $3.5 billion that Germany is sending to Saudi Arabia. Helmut Kohl met with the Jewish leaders in New York. He assured them that the Leopard 2 would not be sold to Saudi Arabia, but he went ahead and made the deal anyway. And in addition to that, Great Britain is taking a contract for a mammoth amount of weapons to be sent to Saudi Arabia and the enemies of Israel. The LA Times has a story, President Reagan's visit to Bitburg Cemetery early this year, and Kohl's honoring of the SS war dead there is burned in the public mind, and even with the late West German Minister of State Alois Merte's statement in February to the Wiesenthal Center that Bonn would not encourage Reagan to visit a concentration camp, there were fears that Germany was embarking on a new course. But what Bitburg really meant to the United States and Israel has now been an open question, because Germany is ready and making deals to send to Saudi Arabia these weapons that could wipe out Israel. So Mr. von Weizsäcker hasn't changed much, and the Gettys haven't changed much in their alignment with the people that were continuous in the past wars, or the last Great War. These people lining up with Adolf Hitler. The New Times, which is Reverend Moon's paper, has a story, a Cold War story written by Tom Bethell. For those of you who don't know the name, it's not a household word. They said he's a contributing editor of Harper and a Washington editor of the American Spectator. Tom Bethell also worked for National Review for Mr. Buckley, William Buckley, and he writes for Reverend Moon's paper, but He is the fellow that came to mind the desk of Jim Garrison when Clay Shaw had been arrested. And when I met him in New Orleans and saw him for 3 days and came home, I said to Jim, you have a CIA man at your desk. And I mentioned Tom Bethel and also Bill Boxley. And I said, you're in danger. And Bethel has worked his way up to be far, far right. He had infiltrated and helped blow the case in many, many ways of Jim Garrison's arrest of Clay Shaw. And now he's writing an article about the Soviet Union, and it's titled, Look for a Return of the Cold War. I don't know where the Cold War ever went away. And he says the Soviet Union will have verbal hostilities against Reagan, and they're angry about the Strategic Defense Initiative, and it's a very anti-Soviet article with a lot of generalities, but Tom Bethel is the author of that article. Also, in the Washington Times, there's amazing stories in that paper, believe it or not. There's an article about José Sarney, the president of Brazil, and how the military are trying to kick him out and how his life is really in danger moment by moment. And there's a trial that's going to take place of a journalist who killed a gentleman, Mario Eugenio. It was the journalist, that was killed, and how this trial is upsetting Brazil, and it could cause a coup there. And I'll do more about that murder later. That was in November of '84. The murder took place, and Brazil's president, José Sarney, who saw what happened to Tancredo Neves, the man who would be president when Sarney was vice president, how he never was sworn in and died. And now he's saying that there's problems there and that the military at any moment could overthrow that country. In the New York Times magazine section and in the book review sections of various newspapers, there is a full-page ad, The Public Interest. It's a magazine that comes out quarterly, or 5 times a year, and their next issue is a large article by Peter Drucker. That's the fellow that I said brought Fritz Kraemer to the United States, and Fritz Kraemer then lined up with Henry Kissinger. And the next issue is going to be on the problems of corporate takeovers, what is to be done. Now, Peter Drucker's name is well known among the multinational corporations, but I see it more and more, and in this one ad, his name is mentioned 7 or 8 times, and he's writing about corporate takeover, and I cited his name just about a month or so ago as being the granddaddy behind the multinationals, creating them larger than countries, that took place after World War II, aligning these countries with the powers of a peanut, and the corporations being the determining factor of the country, shrinking the country down to the dollars and cents of the corporate control of those individual countries. The reason I mentioned Von Damm and Peter Drucker and their name in the news is that another name surfaced in the news just this last month. I haven't put it on the air yet, but now's the time. The well-known Fritz Kraemer that I talk about all the time. I think one of the most dangerous men in the world. I wish he were photographed, but this is the first time I can recall his name being in public, considering all the influences he has had. And it's on a full-page ad of the New York Times, December the 9th, if you want to go to the library. And it's also in the Washington Times, the Moon paper, December the 10th. And it's titled The London Declaration. And the idea behind it is on November 25th, a panel of internationally recognized experts on strategic affairs from the United States and Europe convened in London under the auspices of the International Security Council. This isn't the American Security Council. This is the International Security Council, to consider the implications of the Reagan-Gorbachev meeting. And it's a very important full-page story, but the interesting thing about it is that the International Security Council is a moon organization. It's run by the Moonies, and the names that put the ad in the paper that are listed are very important in terms of positions and policies of the very far right wing. And the name that came to attention, somebody, as a matter of fact, called me and said, wait till you see the paper this morning, because the name on there that was signed was that of Fritz Kraemer, the man, as I say, that was brought over by Peter Drucker and then secured Henry Kissinger for the role that he had at Almaramagau with the top Nazis after the war, and was influential in putting him with Otto Skorzeny and Klaus Barbie, and it seems that relationship never did end. It was continuous. So the ad has the various names. There's one, the paper rattling here, it's a full page of the newspaper. It's International Security Council, signed by Mr. Antonio Betancourt, is the vice president of the group. And then there's other names here. Fritz Kraemer describes himself on the board of this group, former strategy advisor to U.S. Army Chief of Staff. It is very important that Fritz Kraemer comes out publicly in a Reverend Moon front organization because of the implications of Reverend Moon and his connections to LICIO GELLI of the P2, of Reverend Moon, and I mentioned last week the relationship of him and his organization to Klaus Barbie and the Cocaine Kings and the dictatorship in Argentina. So Fritz Kraemer has surfaced. Not only has he shared offices with Daniel Graham of the Strategic Trade, they call themselves a cover group like Strategic Trade, but Daniel Graham is the head of the High Frontier and the SDI, the First Strike Space Star War operation. So what we have is a Kraemer identified with Moon and other organizations such as CAUSA. This is put together by CAUSA, so it won't look like a religious organization. And his name finally appears here. It's an interesting time to surface because people like Peter Drucker and, of course, Kissinger is always visible, and Kraemer feels safe and always will be to be in the papers the same week at the same time. Helene von Damm and the whole team all surface continuously at the same time, but this is the first time Kramer's name has been here, and that's what makes it so interesting. Now, the Washington Post has a story, this is November the 1st, 1985, about the arms procurement and the arms control, and Sven Kraemer, the son of Fritz Kraemer, is the new arms control director, if you can believe it, representing the White House before the Geneva conference. Now, Mr. Betancourt, as this is the vice president, he has an address on Fifth Avenue, and I'll put it on the sheets that accompany this broadcast, the address and the telephone number, if you want information or literature from them. And if you want, send me a self-addressed stamped envelope if you don't subscribe to the weekly tapes and you take this off the air, and I'll give you the information about this organization that is a Mooney organization, the International Security Council. Now, what this statement doesn't say is that they are affiliated with Reverend Moon and are part of CAUSA with Bohai Pack, the liaison to the death squads in South America, the drug traffic, the international drug traffic, the World Anti-Communist League. The entire statement here is praising Reagan for bringing up the struggle of Afghanistan, Angola, Cambodia, Ethiopia, Nicaragua. Nothing about having a safer world with less arms, of course, but representing the cause of freedom. And it says the West must never compromise or retreat from the basic right to self-defense. This was Hitler's thing about invading Poland or Czechoslovakia to defend himself, and they called upon people to understand how strong Reagan was in his summit meeting, that he could stand up to the Russians, and they were glad that he had this strong posture and that he shouldn't let it fall down on the wayside, of course. They applauded him and said that the United States can't afford any illusions about the nature of the USSR. And I'm wondering if America has any illusions about the nature of the Germany we're talking about, the one where Weizsäcker wants to let Mr. Rudolf Hess out, and they're sending weapons to Saudi Arabia that can wipe out Israel at the same time. And here is Fritz Kraemer from Germany working himself up to a position, and with the Mooney organization with Daniel Graham, talking about the nature of Russia when people very hardly know the understanding of the intent of the Germans to continue the 1,000-year Reich and take over the world, and the world includes the United States. They said, we support Reagan's stand on strategic defense and so forth, and we welcome his support of the struggle against communist oppression. and the president made it clear he will not break faith with those fighting the cause of freedom. This is in the article. And the president of the International Security Council is Joseph Churba, C-H-U-R-B-A. He's a retired Air Force colonel. James T. Hackett, editor of the National Security Record, part of the Heritage Foundation. Leopold Labez, who's the editor of a magazine called Survey from the United Kingdom, and he's part of a group called the Resistance International. He's also a member of the Committee for the Free World, and also part of a group, the initials IEDSS, the Institute for Strategic Defense Studies. Those are the short initials for that title. Melvin Lasky is mentioned here. He's the editor of a publication called Encounter. He's part of the Resistance International, run by Mr. Bukowski, and works out of Freedom House and backs the aid to the Contras. He's a member of the Committee for a Free World, a board member of that, and part of IDSS, the Institute for Strategic Defense and Studies, on the Advisory Council of the Heritage Think Tank Group, and an advisory board position of the Reason Foundation. Now, just last week or the week before, I mentioned that 11 people from the Heritage Foundation are now advising the State Department. Also among this group is Ambassador Charles Lichtenstein, former Deputy U.S. Representing the U.S. at the United Nations. He's from the Central Intelligence Agency and worked closely with Jeane Kirkpatrick, lambasting the Soviet Union and lying about the Korean airline and the spy plane situation when it went down. John Lulis is a part of this group. He's Director for Center Research and Information. He's from Greece. Joseph Luns, former Secretary General of NATO from the Netherlands, and then the new NATO chief after him became Lord Carrington, who is a member of the board and first founder with Henry Kissinger of Kissinger Associates, and of course Kissinger is the protege of this Fritz Kraemer, brought into military intelligence and been close with him ever since 1943 when they combined their act. Air Vice Marshal S. Menaul, M-E-N-A-U-L. He's a member of the Board of Research Consultants, which is part of the Mooney Group. He's a consultant to the Foreign Office of the Research Institute, run by members of WACL, the World Anti-Communist League, and Frank Murkowski of the United States Senate, and Martin Sicker, Senior Vice President of the International Security Council, CAUSA, the Moon Group. Those are the names here, but the interesting thing was the Fritz Kraemer name on this, because I have not seen it in print, and I believe this is a first, but I'm sure he feels very secure to appear at this time. Now, just this past week, along with Kramer's name associated with the Moon Organization, CAUSA, Jack Anderson had an article on Taiwan's influence. That's run by the son of Chiang Kai-shek, and Chiang ran it after he fled the mainland of China and set up with Reverend Moon the World Anti-Communist League, which combines the Nazi network, the Odessa network, and the death squads with John Singlaub of our own military. And Jack Anderson wrote about Taiwan's influence. He said there is a strong Oriental influence in the ambitious psychological warfare being waged against all leftists in Latin America. The two sources of this bizarre trans-Pacific cooperation are the government of Taiwan and CAUSA International. That's where Fritz Kraemer comes in on the board of the CAUSA, a group set out by Moon and CAUSA. The latter is a political movement run by former South Korean CIA Colonel Bo Hai-pak, longtime right-hand man to Reverend Sun Myung Moon. The United States may be providing the money that fuels the Salvadorian government's fight against the leftists, but the real expertise comes from Taiwan. This is the word of a Salvadorian military authority. The Taiwanese are the real masters of anti-communist defense. The nationalist Chinese regime on Taiwan was established by the late Chiang Kai-shek 30 years ago when he was driven off the mainland by Mao. They're experts in survival, also with millions and millions of dollars of American money and intelligence money and funding for Taiwan, for his survival, or he wouldn't last an hour. And he's teaching now how to combat communism in Central America and training the troops that go back to Central America. Between Reverend Moon and Taiwan, they're helping to destroy the native population's rights in Central America. I'll take a 1-minute break and go back to this article by Jack Anderson, because it is important now to put Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kraemer into the Mooney Causa camp identified with these front organizations because of the relationship to Daniel Graham and Star Wars, and to the Nazis of the past war and the current Nazis. As I say, we'll take a 1-minute break and continue with this story. This is Mae Brussell, and this is side 2 of broadcast number 735. The importance of the linkage of Fritz Kraemer, a fellow I've talked about for the past 3, going on 4 years now, is very, very important, because taking the role of John Paul Getty and John Paul Getty Jr., and they're working with Otto von Bolschwing and Elmer Bobst and the Henry Cabot Lodge family, the Cabots, and the political context in which our country was literally overthrown. And then linking to Frank Terpel, and what I'm building up to is the relationship of Frank Terpel training Agca for the process of shooting the Pope, working with him and discussing that, and the relationship of Reverend Moon with LICIO GELLI, of the P2, of the Masonic Lodge, of the planned resurgence of Nazism in Europe, and putting in fascist dictatorships, and Reverend Moon's proximity with LICIO GELLI when he fled Italy, and also with Klaus Barbie and the dictators in South America. And now the linkage, which has been going on for a long time, but Jack Anderson just brought out again, of the World Anti-Communist League taking over Central America, the web of the Nazis putting in these military coups, has been a continuous relationship of various people at certain times and places that has not been broken since Hitler came to power in 1933. Now, to conclude the Jack Anderson article, he says the beneficiaries of Taiwan's instruction have repaid their teachers by maintaining diplomatic relations with Taipei, long after most countries have dropped the nationalists in favor of Peking. Causa International, which is again the organization that is in London, the International Security Council. This is Causa International, generously financed by Moon's Unification Church, employs similar techniques, inviting Latin American military men and women and influential civilians on all-expense trips abroad for seminars on common problems. And when they're abroad, as I say, then they can work with the other group under the name of the International Security Council. They talk about common problems. Causa's influence is especially pervasive in Uruguay and Honduras. As a matter of fact, I just cut out an article this last week. Is Honduras going to be another Taiwan, turning it into a Taiwan? And also the fact that Uruguay is having demonstrations of Nazis and swastikas and the resurgence of Nazism in Uruguay. Jack Anderson said, deeply involved in Latin America is the far-flung World Anti-Communist League, originally set up by the South Koreans and Taiwanese government in the late 1960s. In the summer of 1984, Anderson met a military instructor sent by the Japanese chapter of the League to train Mosquito Indians fighting the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua. The League was already the key vehicle for aid to Nicaragua Contras, and behind the scenes was the encouragement of Ronald Reagan and various administration officials. Contra leaders have acknowledged that Taiwan supplies them with the military hardware. The World Anti-Communist League's current president is Major General John Singlaub, whose ties with the Taiwanese and South Korean government go back many years. He was an operative in the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, as was Otto von Bolschwing while he was in the Waffen-SS, and he was then in China, where he served as a liaison to Chiang Kai-shek. In the late 70s, Singlaub commanded American troops in South Korea He was forced to resign by President Jimmy Carter, but he uses his money from the Contras, from Taiwan, and from Reverend Moon's Kwaza to have seminars in South Korea, international seminars. The influence of the World Anti-Communist League in El Salvador is illustrated by the fact that its literature is in the waiting rooms of the Supreme Court justices and in the offices of the President Jose Napoleon Duarte's advisors. So that Reverend Moon and Chiang Kai-shek's son and the Taiwan government have kept this activity going from Asia to London to the highest offices of the Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative, involving Fritz Kraemer and Daniel Graham. And, of course, Henry Kissinger's past role with the Nazis has been documented, and allegedly Klaus Barbie's trial can't start until the election in France is over, and there are so many right-wing people that he is linked to that they may be defeated in the election if it came out. So the network, going back to World War II, is still very much alive, and they are feeding each other through various front organizations called COASA or the International Security Council, and surfacing in various forms. There's a small newspaper called the Latin American Press that is sent to me regularly by one of the listeners, and in there's a story, December 1985, about Reverend Moon. After the U.S. jail term, Moon picks Uruguay as his investment haven. Now, this is very important because it leads to the next part of the program and probably into next week on what is going on with the trial of Agca, the finalizing of that trial, the implications of that trial, the people involved, such as Henry Kissinger, who's the protege of Kraemer, and Moon's closeness to LICIO, GELLI, and the P2, the whole counterintelligence group of disinformation, including Arnaud de Bourchgrave, Reverend Moon's editor for the newspaper in Washington, and Robert Moss, and the various characters that tried to pull off the biggest lie of the trial of the century that's falling flat on its face, but is linked to these various characters and shows the strength of these people trying to pass off major stories or lies that would provoke us to the brink of World War III. Now, this story out of Latin America says in Buenos Aires, comes from Argentina. It cites Uruguay is fast becoming the preferred haven of Reverend Moon. The Anti-Communist Unification Church is guided, of course, we know, by him. The Moonies have invested $60 million in the South American Switzerland in the last 4 years. Major acquisitions are a publishing paper, an influential newspaper, a 5-star hotel, a bank, luxurious apartment complexes, pieces of real estate in Montevideo neighborhoods. After the South Korean leader's imprisonment for tax evasion in the United States, the church moved its operation centers to Latin America. The military government welcomed the Moonies to Uruguay in 1980. Now, 1980 was the time when Ronald Reagan was to be elected president, when it was 1 year before LICIO GELLI was to flee to Argentina and Uruguay. He was centered down in Uruguay and putting a lot of money there with the military. The fiercely anti-communist generals were impressed by the anti-communist doctrine of Reverend Moon, like their counterparts in Brazil, that has had a change of governments, Chile, which hasn't had, Argentina, which has had. The generals at the time in 1980 were under pressure from Jimmy Carter's campaign to curb human rights violations, but these dictatorships paid no attention. Moon's right-hand man, Colonel Bohai Park, praised the patriotic mission of the government in Uruguay. That was, and they also have had a different election, although the so-called democracy enjoys Reverend Moon being there, and they cooperated in their fight against international Marxism. Strident anti-communism marks every aspect of the Moon's theory and practice. The group uses an estimated $1 billion in assets to further its doctrine. It invests in underdeveloped countries that have been snubbed by international investors. The Moons were attracted to Uruguay by liberal laws where they could set up financial operations with minimal government inspection because the country is predominantly Catholic. The Moonies presented them not as a church, but as causa, CAUSA, and again, that's part of the organization that set up the International Security Council. They actually have about 40 different names, which I have in the other room. Colonel Park attempted to establish a beachhead in Argentina under the dictator presidency of General George Videla, Jorge, the J is silent, Jorge Videla. And the Moonies had little success in Paraguay. They wanted to get a foothold there, but General Stroessner is too strong. I guess he didn't want two people the same ilk there, so they didn't encourage him to stay in Paraguay. So the Moonies went into Bolivia under the patronage of Interior Minister General Luis Arce Gomez, and that's the fellow I mentioned last week, with his relationship with Bohai Park and their work with the cocaine kings, cocaine traffic, and also the dictators in South America. This article says the Mooney acquisitions are spectacular in Uruguay. In October 82, a $72 million check was deposited in one bank, and Uruguay's third largest bank has been named Moon's official representative in Uruguay. The check came from Moon's own Bank of Hong Kong. He has the Banco de Credito here, and he has his own banking system, and he purchased $3 million another bank, the Banco de Credito shares, and is buying up banks in Uruguay and having a very strong influence in the newspapers, hotels, entertainment industry. I guess the resort hotels where you can have gambling and all the things that go with drug traffic, all the luxuries of the people that travel through. Now, the story says that Moon had a loan that Wells Fargo Bank canceled of $15 million credit, and the Hanover Trust another $12 million credit. So he desperately needed to buy a bank, which he did. So now in Montevideo he has his own bank. And then the article concludes, no outsider has been able to discover how the Moonies acquired such large amounts of capital. Many suspected it came from the sale of arms and military equipment. The Argentine army uses uniforms and parachutes made in Korea. The Uruguayan army forces have purchased their cannons, machine guns from Moon-supplied. He has the armament factory in South Korea, and he can supply them with their machinery for weapons. So what looks like a religion is a taking over various countries with a tremendous amount of money and influence, working with the drug traffickers, with the dictatorships, anything but a religious organization. It's a front, right out and up front, linked to our CIA, linked to Taiwan, to the people that were kicked out of China because of their drugs, because of their monopoly of capital, of flight capital, oppression of the people, left a terrible record there. And now Reverend Moon has conferences. He had a science conference in Dallas recently and a newspaper conference. Many of you might have seen it on television, where he took the media people to Korea for 1 or 2 weeks to visit there, all expenses paid, and now has the International Security Council telling the president about holding on to the Star Wars defense, don't give it up, and look at these countries of oppression, never citing the areas where they have dictatorships, such as Taiwan. The International Security Council lists in their full-page ad, as I say, Afghanistan, Angola, Cambodia, Ethiopia, Nicaragua. There isn't any word about Chile or South Korea or Taiwan or Haiti or Pakistan, where the military dictators are. Now, going from the next step of Reverend Moon and Fritz Kraemer and Henry Kissinger, the protege of Fritz Kraemer, who is the international bigwig, the traveling State Department, I want to go to the trial that is just winding down in Italy, the trial of the century that has to do with Agca, and how this thing is going completely, the wind is out of the operations. There's no headlines, not very many in the United States, but an account of the way the trial is winding down. For 1 year after the Pope was shot, Agca said he acted alone, but immediately Alexander Haig and the State Department were pushing the story of terrorism, international terrorism, as was Claire Sterling. And if you remember, NBC had a full 1 hour program, it seemed like 10 hours, titled The Man Who Shot the Pope, A Study in Terrorism, put together by Marvin Kalb. and Marvin Kalb is a protege. He and Bernard Kalb worked close with Henry Kissinger under the tutelage always of Fritz Kraemer, and Kraemer has been identified. Now he's surfaced. If not before, he was just a military retired. Now he's surfaced as part of CASA and the Moon operation. And Reverend Moon is so close to LICIO GELLI and the Italian scandals that surfaced at the time of the Pope shooting that it makes the Marvin Kalb program on NBC even more interesting, as I say, now that Kraemer has surfaced in this light. But the first story was that Agca worked alone. Then he was carefully coached by people from the Italian intelligence, from American intelligence, from the mafia, and came up with an entirely different story while he was saying, and there was enough reason to create this stupid trial, and he was saying the Bulgarians were part of it, and the Turkish leftist group were part of the plan to shoot the Pope and promote him to do this job. And if they did it, then the Russians know, because they know everything that's going on. Well, that whole thing has completely fallen apart. And the U.S. teams that have been exposed to the 9 months of trial include Francesco Pazienza of Italian intelligence and also who works with the CIA, Alexander Haig, a Knight of Malta, close to the Vatican, and also who thought he would take over just 2 months earlier when Ronald Reagan was shot. And Reagan, I presume, was not supposed to live, and Haig would be the vicar. Another person whose name appears in these articles and exposés, and will do more, is that Michael Ledeen, who's persona non grata in Italy. They don't want him over there. And his wife, Barbara Ledeen, isn't written up very much, but she worked for the Defense Department. And another part of the cast of characters involved is Paul Hensey of the CIA, who worked in Turkey and was part of our Defense Department's aggravated assault against Turkey for the purpose of military dictatorship. Frank Turple of the CIA, who worked and trained Agca. Claire Sterling, the middlewoman, the propagandist between Turkey and the Central Intelligence Agency, the military dictatorship, and the CIA. These are the characters that have surfaced just in the 9 months and are also related to Robert Keith Gray, that office in Washington, the Public Relations Office, and Gray worked under Henry Kissinger with Task Force 157. I'll go into a few of the articles the past 2 weeks and then mention some references that I had on the air in 1981 to show my analysis of what happened when the Pope was shot, and then some sections of a whole article, like it's almost book length, from Covert Action on the shooting of the Pope that came out in the spring of 1985. The New Times is the magazine from the Soviet Union. In November this year, they had a story, The Antonov Case, the Capitalist System of Justice and Human Rights. And it brings out the fact that Italy ratified in the United Nations the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in 1976 to guarantee rights regarding court procedures. And this article tells how Mr. Sergei Antonov has been locked up for 3 years and how Italy has entirely based this case on the press, on Agca, who's a Turkey terrorist of the far right, that the mass media has entirely ignored the intent of this UN resolution, this covenant that all of them signed, and that they tried to make the Bulgarians guilty by mass indoctrination in the media of saying it over and over again of the links of Agca to the leftists or the Bulgarians, because he stayed in Bulgaria, Sofia, Bulgaria, a short while, and used a passport with a different name. They tried to say, therefore, the Bulgarians knew who he was, and therefore the Russians knew, and it had their approval. And none of this is holding up. And this article from the Soviet Union talked about the mistreatment of Antonov in perverting this entire case. The New York Times, November the 6th, has a story on Omer Mersan, M-E-R-S-A-N, a Turkish businessman from West Germany who saw Agca and paid Agca some money on behalf of a gentleman from Turkey, an arms dealer who was part of the Turkish underworld, but he never met Agca before. He didn't know why the money was paid to him, and he had no role in this murky plot. The Washington Post, December 21st, had a story, Bulgarian colonel in Agca case, and it tells how a fellow from Bulgaria, the court went to Bulgaria, and Lieutenant Colonel Vasilay said that all of this is hogwash, that he never met Agca, that he doesn't know what he's talking about. And the court couldn't figure out how Agca got the details of these people, the Bulgarians, because when they took the judges and the world press was there, filled with press, it turns out this fellow never met him in his life. And Agca knew the movements of these people and their characteristics and their telephone numbers. And obviously, the Italian intelligence and the American CIA through Pazienza and these people were feeding him enough information that a trial was started. And finally, they did go to Turkey. And there was nothing that they could find out, any links or evidence. There isn't a shred of evidence to link the Eastern Europeans, except the fact that he stayed in a hotel run by a Japanese concern in Sofia, Bulgaria, for a very short time. And they even questioned whether, in fact, he had been there because the registry didn't have the passport alias that Agca used. It wasn't at the hotel. Now, the New York Times, December 22nd, has a story, "Testimony in Pope case ends in Sofia. The 2 judges and the 6 jurors will hand down a verdict." And now, as of last week, they say the testimony is likely to buttress the prosecution's contention that the Bulgarians paid at least $1.2 million to make the story of the Soviet Union responsible for the assassination attempt on the Pope. And they said the defendants will all be acquitted, for they can either say they're guilty or they're not guilty or they're acquitted for lack of evidence. And remember the famous Warren Commission memos of the staff that I got from the National Archives, where they said, we can't say that Jack Ruby wasn't part of a conspiracy because we haven't even looked into that, but we'll say we have found no evidence that he has because we haven't found any, we haven't looked. So the Warren report said there was no evidence that Jack Ruby was part of any larger conspiracy. And the purpose of doing that, they said in the New York Times, was it leaves room for doubt about the innocence of the accused. And I said when the trial began and Agca said he was Jesus Christ, that they knew they didn't have the evidence when the trial began 9 months ago. So by Agca saying, I'm Jesus Christ, it makes everything else look stupid, and all the lies can't just be lies because you could say, well, the guy's mentally sick. And they realized they made a mistake with the trial, but they had to go through the monkey trial. And so they'll leave you questioning whether or not these men really were guilty, but as far as they went, they found no evidence. Now, this trial wasn't against the right wing. It wasn't against the Grey Wolves and the Nazis. It wasn't against the drug dealers, the gun smugglers. It was against the Bulgarians and 3 Turks. So 4 Bulgarians and 3 Turks. So if they can't find them guilty, that doesn't mean someone else wasn't behind the plot. It just means that they haven't prosecuted and probably never will and won't go any further. But the more they looked, according to the New York Times, and the more they questioned, what emerged was the Turkish right-wing circles that supported Agca. And that involves, again, Robert Gray, the public relations man who represents Turkey, and Paul Henze of the CIA, because Gray worked with Wilson and Turple claims that he trained Agca, and Gray worked with Henry Kissinger, and Kissinger was named by Agca as being part of the coaxing to change the story, so that Kissinger and Turple are linked to Task Force 157 and also George Bush when he was director of the CIA. The New York Times said the court learned from the testimony of a racketeer and a former Italian intelligence official that Agca was coached to implicate the Bulgarians. The racketeer, of course, was Mr. Pandico, I mentioned him before, and the intelligence official was Mr. Pazienza. And it says Pazienza said this week, and this is important, that he possessed documents and evidence that he has now put into a safe bank account where he will keep it, that's in a Swiss bank. And the New York Times questioned whether he's going to blackmail American or Italian officials because he doesn't want to be extradited back to Italy. And Pazienza was indicted last year for trying to subvert Italy's intelligence service, and now this past week he's been charged with the further role in the 1980 bombing, the Bologna bombing outside of Milan, the train station where 80 to 85 people were killed. The figure varies depending what book you read, but the Bologna bombing links directly to Klaus Barbie, who's part of that, not Klaus Barbie, LICIO GELLI, who's been indicted, and Stefano Della Calle, and a group of other terrorists. And of course, they make a full circle back, their relationship to Klaus Barbie and Bohai Park and Reverend Moon. And here's Fritz Kraemer, Kissinger's protege, Kissinger's boss, not his protege, linked to Moon, and the full cycle of these people of Nazis and terrorism surfaces very loud and clearly in 1985. The Washington Post has an article, Italian Court Ends Probe of Papal Plot. They said the court was unable to shake any blanket denials that these people had that they never dealt with Agca. When they went to Turkey to interview them, they couldn't shake they were firm that they didn't know Agca. And through this entire investigation for 9 months, they couldn't find any trace of money that allegedly was paid to Agca. This over $1 million. And the conspiracy theory appeared to be gathering momentum, the Washington Post said, when Giovanni Pandico described the meeting with Agca and the meeting with the former deputy head of the Italian Secret Service, General Pietro Musumeci. Originally called the trial of the century, this is in the Washington Post, it will end without a Bulgarian connection or the communist propagandists who accuse CIA of masterminding the plot. It's not going to be either one. The Russians say that the CIA planned it, and the Italian government was saying the Bulgarian connection there, it's not going to prove either one. The reason it's not going to prove either one is they're not going into it. And quite a few articles in the Washington Times about the end of the trial and how it's almost over. Now, interestingly enough, the Washington Post had a story just recently about Caspar Weinberger and Ronald Reagan preparing for a war, but we need a revolution. And this goes into and leads into the real motive and the creation of this whole story to whip people up that the Russians and the Bulgarians wanted to shoot the Pope, again, the Antichrist trying to kill the religious leader, and shooting at him to instigate this, whip up this hysteria, which was very needed at that particular time because of things that our government was planning in stretching our boundaries from America over to Europe and to the Middle East and getting ready and closer for the war that we have been building ourselves up for. The story in the Washington Post, Sunday, December 15th, has a full-page article, just equivalent full page, to prepare for war, we need a revolution. And this article says we're not very good at peacetime preparing for war, and for 40 years we've tried to turn ourselves into a warrior nation. We've spent $300 billion a year for weapons, but what we really need is something to get us into the war that people aren't ready yet to go in. And they describe a little firefighting in Grenada, a dogfight in Libya, but in order to get a real war going, we have to have some national outrage. And this article goes on how we've spent so many dollars for weapons, and that we spend $50 million for a single fighter plane. The flying time for a B-1 bomber is $12,000 for 1 hour for the bomber, $12,000. It's just a little bit. The Defense Department has 54,000 people shopping and spending $28 million an hour we're spending for weapons. And the article implies that we can't keep doing this unless we have somebody to go for. And the whole point about the motive, one of the motives for getting the Polish Pope is to whip these people into a lather and encourage them to get ready for a war against Russia. And if the Pope were to be killed, the Polish Pope, it would certainly arouse all of Eastern Europe. Now, strangely enough, there was an article about the Armageddon and Ronald Reagan simultaneously with all this in the past week or so, describing, it's from another small newsletter that a listener sent me. She sent me one that I cited earlier in the evening. This is from the Coalition for a New Foreign and Military Policy, and it's about Ronald Reagan's religion as a cause of World War III. And in one section of this article, it says that a former California state senator wrote about a conversation with Reagan in 1971, talking about nuclear Armageddon, and that he thought the armies of the ungodly nations would rise against the communists and that Libya would be among them. The significance of that is that Libya is now communist, and that's a sign that the Armageddon isn't far off. Now, all these recent provocations that you see are leading to Libya. And what happened was, as the Polish Pope script failed and fell flat on its bottom, the Defense Department can come up with another provocateur type of action, which is really on the brink of World War III. And the coalition close-up, the fall 1985, describes Reagan's philosophy going back in 1971 about Libya and the Armageddon. And if we didn't get the Polish Pope and pull that one and antagonize the East, we could get our foot in the Mediterranean by going after Mr. Gaddafi in Libya. And this is part of the Armageddon prophecy of Ronald Reagan. And next week, I want to just update some current news, and I also want to continue with that trial in Rome that is winding down because of the significance of the people that link through this whole saga to Washington, D.C., and to Mr. Fritz Kraemer and Reverend Moon and LICIO GELLI. And the time period, take you back to that time period and where we are now in relationship to the scary script that they keep pushing. If they can't get away with one, they try the other and keep whipping up this frenzy and publish large articles, and television is a good propaganda tool to prepare us for this war in the Mediterranean. The time is up now, so I'll come back to it next week, and the interconnection of these various people going back from World War II to where they are influencing us today. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell. You take care, and I'm using your articles. Thanks for sending them. I get many I don't have time to use at the current hour, but we'll use eventually. Thanks again for all of that, and I'll be back with you to share some more news. It goes fast enough. It'll be 1 week.